All right, amazing. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us on this instance of the Evolutesix monthly webinars. On today's special, we have a session titled Unmasked, Uncovering the Elephants in the Room for a Circular Economy with panelists Brian Bauer and our own Graham Boyd. Right before we get into the meat of it, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping here, get you folks up to speed with the format of today's session. And how we will be proceeding with this is I'll be providing at the beginning a little bit of context, introducing our panelists for today. And then we'll dive right in for approximately half an hour. We'll have the panelists in discussion, bringing in their expertise, their perspectives, to help us better understand what are these inherent limitations in our economic system preventing us from circularizing the economy and other sectoral issues that are presenting important challenges. By the end of that little session, it'll take about half an hour, then we'll be more than happy to open up the floor to questions. However, obviously, as questions arise, please jot them down in the chat. If you would prefer to hold on to them and come in with the questions and ask them yourself, that'll be perfectly fine. And then we'll move on to concluding remarks, some 5 minutes or so before the top of the hour. That'll be our first section of this session. However, as many of us know, some of the more interesting conversations often happen at what you might call, if you will, the after party section of events. So we are also happy to open up a space for about half an hour after the top of the hour, where folks who may want to stick around, grab a little coffee or drink, and participate in live dialogue in the conversation are more than welcome to do so. So as you see, our session is being recorded, so this will be uploaded to YouTube and other social media. So if you have any objections to you appearing in the recording or anything for that matter, please do let me know either now, later, or after the end of the session. So I will make a note of that and make sure that we count with everybody's consent in showing their faces, beautiful faces, to the public. Right, so diving in. So my name is Stefan. I'm coming in as the master of ceremony for this session today. My official role in Evolutesix is a growth anchor. And I am so pleased today to join you folks for this beautiful session. One key process point here is you might see me at some point perhaps do this little sign, which will be a timid and respectful way of asking you to wrap up if you've gone a little over time with, say, answering a point or asking a question, just to keep us on the clock. So our two panelists today are Brian Bauer and Graham Boyd, Santiago, Chile, where he is currently acting as an external consultant for UNEP, working on reusable packaging. He was the leading circular economy and strategic partnerships lead for Algramo, which is developing reusable packaging systems for many global corporations of global renown, particularly smart packaging. And in his own words, which you may very well read in the bio of our event today, you can see many of the condecorations that Brian's work has earned him and his practices. And he brings a strong academic but very practice-oriented background, which is something that we cannot have enough in these dire times, looking for workable solutions to the bigger issues of our time. And our very own Graham Boyd, I'll keep his introduction short because many of you probably already know him. He is the innovator behind Evolutesix and responsible for the development of the Fair Shares Common model of incorporation and business design lens, as well as bringing in from the fields of physics the insights from Ergoticity and integrating those into our comprehensive business regeneration methodology. Because if maybe if you're not aware, Evolutesix's essence as a business is building new startups and transforming these existing or their existing businesses so that they can have the cutting edge competences that they need to succeed in today's very, very uncertain world. So without further ado, a little bit of context setting. So I need not remind you how dire the global situation is. In many fronts, we are facing what seems to be unsurmountable challenges, and obviously the planetary boundaries are being exceeded by far too long, putting human survivability and all other the biosphere's life at stake. And adding to that disenchantment, I just want to share with you an interesting little thing that I saw a couple of days just to really drive home the point of how bad our economy, as it's currently structured, keeping things going. I'll share this interesting post of a lady, which I will not name right now for the sake of privacy, but we'll share the post with you in the chat, who decided to leave the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who you may be very well familiar, is one of the great institutes working to advance the circular economy. And why would somebody decide to leave such a forward-thinking venture in an institute? Well, in her own words, she does not want to reflect on the sustainability of a quote-unquote anti-aging cream without challenging the necessity of the cream itself, the beauty standard that it perpetuates. I do not want to promote plastic bottles with quote-unquote recycled virgin material that will be sold at a premium. I want to promote access to quality water for all. By putting our efforts into the first one, we create the illusion that this option is, quote unquote, the best of both worlds. So we are in dire need of radical solutions that really take into account the systemic issues that we must overcome. And so in order to kick off the discussion, right before we dive into these elephants in the room and what they may be, I would like to hear from Brian. Could you help us articulate what is the promise that the circular economy is making? What is it offering us that we don't have today that we might have tomorrow?
I guess one of the biggest biggest factors to bring into that question would be a systems change. Quite often when we're looking at making things better, when we're working from the perspective of the sustainability world, it can be too incremental. We can look at trying to do something like, as you were mentioning with the bottle, increase the PCR content, have the maximum amount of recycled material in the bottle. We need to rethink the whole system and change the whole system across all different material flows. And that's really what I see as one of the core challenges of the circular economy, is getting people to redesign the system. And one of the key challenges for that too is often what I call institutional lock-in effect. So quite often in our economy or in a supply chain, you have very, very significant sunken cost to infrastructure. And those infrastructure sunken costs can often have a payback of multiple decades. And once you have that infrastructure locked into a current product or system or service, it's really hard to move away from that because you're locked into that investment for 30 years until it has an ROI. And I think those are some of the core issues around that question.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, so that already puts us fair and square within the realm of these elephants in the room. But I would like to ask you to speak a little bit more about what is it then that we would gain in our quality of life, the way that we relate to other humans in an economic sense, to other living beings when we are living within the circular economy paradigm. How does life change when we're in that?
I guess as you were talking about previously about respecting planetary boundaries, what the circular economy is at a very fundamental level, the kind of grandfather of the circular economy, Walter Stahl, defines this as one of his key points in the circular economy, at least how I see key points of his for the circular economy. He says the circular economy is all about keeping atoms and molecules at their highest value for as long as possible. So if we can do that, if we can keep those atoms and molecules at their highest value for as long as possible, we radically reduce the amount of resources we need to have a comfortable life, to have just a comfortable life. It's about having a comfortable life. We probably can't keep having a comfortable life like we have been, because we're running up against planetary boundaries. We're over extracting key resources. So we need to rethink the system so that we are able to have that comfortable life that we all want to enjoy.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So you say particles and molecules and atoms, and I can already see Graham's physics brain turning. So we'll probably get a comment from him at that stage. But I love it. So we've already started to touch upon some of these elephants in the room, some systemic cost infrastructure that is certainly holding us back. What are some of these other elephants in the room, whether they may belong systemically, endemically to the economic system that we operate over, as well as other sectors? What does politics have to say about this? What does the law have to say about this, that they would prefer much to say behind closed doors? And this is a question for both of our panelists, both Graham and Brian. So I'll pass it back on to you, whoever would like to go first.
I've been speaking, so I'll pass it on to Graham and let him go first.
Actually, I would prefer that you head first, rather stay in a response mode to what you say.
Perfect.
Okay, sounds good. I guess some of the issues would be like, let's talk about two interrelated issues, finance and policy and regulation. So I'm going to go to my area of expertise, which is packaging. And I was recently speaking with some global experts on how to get FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods companies, like the one that Graham used to work with, as an example. He used to work at Procter & Gamble, that level of company, how to get them to be able to use reusable packaging at a significant scale. The kind of hypothesis on reusable packaging set forth by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others is approximately 20, and now some are even saying 30% of the average packaging that you see in your average supermarket can be sold in reusable packaging. But right now, not even 1% is sold in reusable packaging outside of the beverage space. In the beverage space, Coca-Cola, as an example, they have 20 global markets. That means 20 countries where over 50% of their beverage consumption happens in reusable bottles. 50%. But I was speaking to some experts that work on that are working in the space, working at some high-profile consultancies in the European Union. And they noted that Coca-Cola is doing really well in doing reusable packaging where there's policy and regulation in place that basically makes them needed to do that. And then in other markets where there's not policy and regulation in place, they don't do that. So regulation can kind of set the frameworks and help motivate basically the global economy to move in the right direction and make those systemic investments, those which are significant. Like for Coca-Cola to do, I was just reading an article this morning about some investments they did in Brazil. They put $400 million into reuse kind of fill lines. And then they spent, I think it was $25 million just on redesigning a bottle so that all of their products, all their Coca-Cola branded products across the whole portfolio could use that one bottle. These are massive, major investments that are required to happen. And if there's not the kind of nudge to allow that policy to make sense, it often doesn't happen. And then going to finance often won't move, allow the money to go into.
Hold on, sorry. Florian, could I ask you to mute your mic? That might just be it. Oh, okay, good.
Okay, so I was saying basically with finance, which is a really critical lever for the circular economy, finance is not comfortable moving until it knows that the industry is ready to move and invest and push forward an opportunity, a change in the system. So there's a really interesting interplay between regulation and policy and finance. And then once those two things align, it can set up the conditions to enable a system shift, enable a company like, say, Coca-Cola, where it is able to do 50% of its consumption in reusable packaging, whereas it has other markets, many other markets, where it has 0% of its consumption or close to 0% of its consumption happening in reusable packaging. That would be my answer to your question.
So before Graham responds, I do want to pick your brain about this, and particularly call upon your expertise with materials science, right? So we know cradle to cradle is the way. We have these statistics, something like 90% of plastic doesn't get recycled. Could you speak a little bit about the design and material constraints, particularly to the relationship that those design choices have with financial incentives, structural financial incentives?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in design and material sciences, but I have read a lot of background information on those issues. But essentially what you need to get down to is developing developing a packaging system that will provide the longest utility for the lowest cost while providing the least impacts to the environment and human health. And one, like what Coca-Cola did, I mentioned they had that one bottle design, the shift in a bottle design. They spent $25 million on changing a bottle design in one market in just Brazil, so that all of their products could use that one bottle design. If you can get the entire sector to come together, if we could get like all the beverage players to come together and use one bottle, that could create massive economies of scale for collection, for storage, for reverse logistics, for sanitization, for fill line technology. And that's the kind of thing that we need to bring in if we want to see a more circular elements brought into packaging systems.
Right. Well, that is a big if, and if we can get them together, I guess would be sort of what the future of mankind and humanity hinges. And I know certainly that Graham would like to share some thoughts on how we can achieve that. So I'll pass on this space to you because you have some good thoughts on that.
Thank you, Stefan. Multiple thoughts have been going through my head. The first thought is an example of superb circular packaging that's out there that probably everybody in the call knows and has had in their hands. And it's the package called a banana skin. Yeah, nature is superb in terms of the circularity of banana skins. Yeah, the definition you gave, Brian, from Walter Starr, keeping atoms and molecules at their highest value as long as possible. Well, the packaging of the banana has done that for hundreds of thousands of years, you know, without any degradation of the molecules used to make banana skins. And the way that nature does that, as you said at the beginning, the entire system is designed to do that. It's not about a given banana skin goes back to being used for the next banana, but everything in nature is in big circles. And I see that as one of the biggest barriers is we need the entire systems change. As you said, we have lock-in through the sunk cost fallacy, but we also have locked in the current system because of various things, in particular, our codified approach to economics. Neoclassical economics, in many senses, prevents us from building a circular economy because it's coming from a paradigm of extract, use, and throw away. And that's deeply built into economics and hence built deeply into our policy, our regulations, and how the entire finance market works. So, you know, a build then on that. I used to work in Procter & Gamble packaging development. And so I spent a fair amount of time in P&G packaging, pushing for PCR, post-consumer recycled packaging, designing packaging for reuse, for recycling. And one of the biggest things we kept running into in terms of the total system, for example, is that unless everybody plays according to the same circular rules, it's not financially viable for anybody to play according to it. So that's the one side of it. But then we run into, on the finance side, the entire design of investing in companies is not really conducive to circularity because, first of all, there's this myth that investors own the company. Now, actually, legally, the company is a legal person like any of us here and is not actually legally the property of the investors. In law, a company is a person that is party to a contract with another person, the investor. And so to really make the circular economy mainstream, part of what Brian's pointing at with our entire systems change is the necessity to actually incorporate companies in such a way that all of the other companies in a circle have voting rights across each of the company in the circle, that the investor in perhaps an anchor company in a circular economy, that those investors can't simply decide to sell the company and pull it out of the circle or extract profit. As soon as that is possible, you have a race to the bottom. And the other thing that has to go in, and maybe I'll come more to that in a moment, but there is a core concept called ergodicity. And this is something that neoclassical economics completely neglects. Nature recognizes this characteristic of life, of growth, across all of nature's capitals. By ignoring it in natural capital, we also shut down a number of strategies that are vital for circularity to work. And in particular, what that tells us, what nature recognizes, is that in a world full of unpredictability, the best strategy to use in my own self-interest is a strategy of cooperation with my enemies. And that is at the heart of how nature works. It follows a strategy of real, tangible, practical cooperation across all of nature between species that have an animosity between them, like predator-prey. And until economics recognizes this fact about how capital works, policy regulation, which is heavily steered by neoclassical economics thinking, is going to continue to block the necessary collaboration, blinded by what economics is saying, that competition is the best solution. Not actually true. Nature has proven that more than adequately. So I will pause at that point and hand back to you, Stefan.
Yeah, first, Brian, would you like to respond to anything that that Graham's brought in?
Maybe just one quick comment to a book I read a little while ago that really complements a lot of what Graham was talking about. It's a book called Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. And it basically looks at that idea of the value that you can get from competing organizations or things in a system coming together and working together as one, and that value creation that can be had through that type of structure. So just want to mention that.
Brilliant. Yes, I will share a link to that book in just a moment. Great. So we're almost at the point to open up the floor to questions, but I would like to prompt both of you to give us a little bit of insight and guidance into what are some of these first steps that we can take as individuals, companies, ecosystems of companies in order to circularize our economy, and what are some of the things to watch out for, right? Because not everybody has $25 million to invest into the design of a bottle, right? So what are some other cost-efficient strategies that we can implement into our day-to-day operations that get us closer to circularity? And back to both of you.
Again, from my point of view of packaging, I think packaging is really interesting because it's something that every one of us has probably interacted with 50 times today. Packaging is extremely ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And one of the main challenges that a lot of companies are seeing, and one of the main reasons I think why some of the big brands like the big global FMCG brands have backed away a little bit over the past few years from reusable packaging, is consumer behavior change. Consumers are too locked in to the convenience and simplicity of single-use packaging, and they're not making the effort to use these new systems because it's slightly more complex. And when you see something that is truly circular, like they say, you vote with your wallet, that's a really critical factor. Vote with your wallet, support circularity when you see something that is circular. And I think packaging is really exciting because, like I said, you have so many contact points with it. So if you do see a reusable bottle, a reusable beverage, a reusable detergent, start doing that, because that's one material type that everyone uses. And if everyone starts doing one material type, we open up people's minds to think differently about other material types. And then eventually we can have many different material types being used in a circular manner so that the global economy moves from 7-point-something% circularity towards 7-point-something% not being circular. That's what we need to move towards.
Beautiful.
Right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll put in a thought, and then I'd love to hear from Brian. Are there any other elephants in the room that are big elephants that nobody's talking about? But a comment from me, I think what Brian is pointing at is absolutely spot on. There's also lock-in in the minds of people who are buying the products, the consumers who want convenience, they want all of these things. And this is something that we cannot change with facts. It's what a friend of mine, Rory Sutherland, calls psychologic rather than logic. It's about how do people think? How do we perceive things? And this is where we can tap into all of the expertise of marketing, only tap into it from the stance of how do we work with people in such a way that what we're communicating connects with them at a personal, deep level and what they really want. And as a simple example of this, one of the tests that I know of was looking at two different sets of text on the packaging of, I think, biscuits to go with tea, what the Americans would call cookies. And one of them, and the contents were identical. One of them, the packaging referenced them as being low-fat biscuits. The other one, the packaging referenced it as being healthy and sustainable. And there were two different tests that were done. They were taste tests. The one taste test was completely blind. The full fat versus the low fat. And in the taste test of the full fat versus the low fat, the blind taste test ranked them equally. So there was no factual difference in taste, none whatsoever. In the non-blind taste test, the packaging marked low fat was regarded as tasting significantly worse than the normal package. And the package labeled healthy was ranked as equivalent in taste and just as worth buying. And so that's an example of psychologic at work. There was no actual difference in the taste between the biscuits, but what was written on the package dramatically changed the perceived taste of the biscuit in the person's mind. And I think this is something where there's a lot that we still have to learn about in the whole arena of circularity, donut, regenerative, and so on, that we need to find the messaging that doesn't trigger the additional psychologic of, if it's low fat, it's going to taste worse. If it's circular, it's going to be less effective. If it's regenerative, it's not going to be as good. There's that kind of logic in a lot of people's minds at the moment. Brian, back to you. Any other big elephants that we should be aware of?
Let me think here. One potential one could be the rebound effect. So the rebound effect is when you create a new product or service, and then it leads to the higher consumption of that product or service because it's been developed more efficiently or at a reduced cost. As an example, if you can produce a product and it provides a product or service at a lower cost, and that product is also developed in a way that it uses a little bit less energy or it's a little bit greener, people can be like, okay, well, I can now use that product a little bit, it's a little bit cheaper and it has a little bit reduced impact. So I can use it twice as much or 3 times as much. And then you end up consuming twice as much of a resource as you otherwise would. And that's also an interesting That's an interesting concept to think about in the concept. The kind of, it ties into this idea that Graham was talking about. I haven't heard the term before, but psychologic and the idea of recycling. I'll just talk for a minute or two about global recycling of plastics. We as a global economy have been working hard at recycling plastics for over 40 years. We put in many, many, many billions of dollars into recycling infrastructure for 40 years. Today, the global recycling rate for plastics is at 9%. 9%. If you look at it on a kind of a country level, take the United States, one of the most developed, most wealth-intensive economies on the planet, they're at 5% after 40 years. And another thing too, when you look at that 9%, of the plastic that goes into the entire system, only 2% of the plastic is recycled at equal or higher value. So think about this too. If you have an average consumer who says, no, I can drink my single-use, drink the bottle for the bottle of water, and they drink it in 10 or 15 minutes, and they just throw it into the magic recycle bin where they think it just gets, boom, it gets made into a new bottle. If people realized that like 2% of that plastic that goes in there comes out into a new bottle at equal or higher value, and that 91% of that does not even make it into the recycling system, I think people would think a lot differently about their comfort with consuming single-use packaging, especially at the voracious rate that we're doing it now. So we need to think about understanding solutions to environmental problems, and if those solutions are true solutions or false solutions, like is the case in the case of what the plastic recycling efforts have shown over the past 40 plus years.
Yeah.
A build on that 2%. Compare that to nature. Yeah, nature sits at 100%. Actually, nature sits above 100% because one of the key characteristics of life is its capacity to continuously increase the capacity of the planet to support life. So nature is actually sitting at above 100% in a sense, because it's taking atoms and molecules from places or from structures where they are not supporting life at all and modifying them so that they can enter the circularity material chain that supports life. And so 2% is really atrocious. Even 98% is not yet good enough. And that's for me, one of the biggest elephants around circularity. And I think it comes to that rebound effect you're talking about, where people are thinking that we're doing actually a lot better than we are in terms of recycling. I think most people would be horrified to know that it's only 2%. I think many think that it's well above that. And at the same time, when you look at the maths, even if you're at 95% and you've done 10 sequences of recycling, I think by the 10th sequence, you're only recycling something like 10% of what went into the first stage. After the 10th one, even if you're recycling at each stage or going into the circular sequence, 95% of the material, that compounding of 0.95 times 0.95 times 0.95 after 10 gets you to a pretty low number. So I see that as one of the big elephants in the room.
On top of that too, Graham, in the context of plastic, it typically can only be recycled about 3 to 5 times before the polymers degrade too much, and then it can't be recycled anymore. It needs to be significantly downcycled. So there are many materials like glass, as an example, can almost be infinitely recycled, but still what you were saying holds true for glass, but to a much lesser extent. But with plastics, it's clearly an absolute failure. And if we look at all the other externalities across the value chains of plastic, so that's going way downstream to the extraction of hydrocarbons, and then way to the upstream of like what happens at the end of that product's life, there's significant impacts across that whole value chain. And we need to kind of understand impacts across the whole value chain. People only really tend to think about, the very obvious, the ones that you can clearly see and the one that get a lot of attention. But if you look across the whole value chain of a product, there's impacts across every stage.
Yes.
And they're often invisible because no one really picks up on them or understands them or articulates them.
Yes,
So
exactly.
I'll jump in here just to start shifting gears so we can open up to our audience with any questions or comments that you would like to bring at this stage. We'll love to hear from you. Amazing. I see one hand. Donna, go for it.
Okay, let me see if I can kick it off a little bit. I think what I'm hearing loud and clear so far is a clear picture of how we are nowhere near circularity and the elephants and the myths that kind of keep people thinking that, oh, we're moving down the track, and how all this incrementalism, all the while we're sliding back down and farther away and getting closer to the cliff. So that's one thing that came through loud and clear. I think the thing that people will be interested to hear more about is, if that's the reality, and people do need to wake up to that, what are the alternatives that start to truly move the needle in ways that are substantive, not just this incremental, oh, I'm doing less harm or I'm doing my bit at every level of society. And I'll throw in my messy humanist stuff in there around the transparency that's needed that makes it okay for people to acknowledge that none of us have got this. We're all late adopters. We need to find a way to be more transparent around what's really going on and the barriers and the things that are currently just not workable, so that people start to work together more in that circular way to move towards a regenerative world and economy. Check.
Thank you. I'll invite some responses from our panelists if you would like.
Brian?
One thing I would say is, I think, unfortunately, circularity can't just happen like that. There's like some of these issues that we've talked about before, these institutional lock-in effects. Things take time. And I mean, in a perfect world, we could change everything quickly. But I think how I would see circularity happening is certain kind of material flows or material markets becoming more and more circular. Those creating environmental benefits that the companies get to tout about, creating economic savings that the companies get to tout about. And then other industries and other sectors will be like, plastic sector just did this. They've radically transformed. They've rethought the way we're using that resource. They're now reduced in emissions, their carbon emissions, their carbon intensity by 90x%. Their profits are up 28%. And they have a way better relationship with the people using their product. If that can happen in one sector, then other sectors will start to replicate and copy what that one sector, that one material flow did. So I think that's a really critical thing to realize too, is that it probably is going to happen in a material by material or sector by sector space, and then evolve. But it will take a little while to happen, unfortunately. That's just the way I think things will work. I could be wrong, but those are my views. Graham?
Yeah, picking up on that, I completely agree with what you've just said, Brian. And I will bring into that is one of the enablers that can help that to happen is, first of all, if we start in an arena where either it's a new material that doesn't exist yet or is barely being used, or we're starting up a new circular ecosystem of companies. And then we bring in two things. First of all, we bring into the governance of each of the companies governance power, voting power by all of the stakeholders that are touched by that material in that circularity, so that the company, all of the companies in the circle can be held to account for staying at maximum circularity by all of the stakeholders, rather than hoping that the representatives of money will somehow altruistically govern on behalf of everybody else. Isn't going to happen. And that's why we focus on incorporating companies as a fair shares commons, because the fair shares commons automatically includes all stakeholders, all capitals in governance. And in particular, what that means in the circle is that all of the other companies in the circle have interlocking governance power in each other. And that prevents any investor, say in an anchor company in the circle, selling the company and extracting profit. It also removes the incentive of the first company to underinvest in the circularity of the whole circle. You know, the first company can invest heavily to optimize the entire circle, even if that means that the first company will run at a negative rate for 10, 20 years, which is way beyond the horizon of most investors. And the other thing that has to go in, you know, is the whole ergodic investment strategy, the strategy that nature uses when it's investing natural capital, and that is anathema or actually ignored by economics and modern investment practice. And that ergodic investment strategy, well, that goes quite deep and is beyond the time remaining here. But the essence of ergodic investment is investing in the entire circle, not into any individual company. You see that in nature. Nature invests in 1,000 trees as one forest in one soil. Nature does not try to create a forest with 1,000 trees in individual pots. You know, as John Fullerton says, it's just dumb to invest in individual companies. You cannot build regenerative companies if each company is being invested in independently. You have to invest in the entire circle or the entire forest. And the beauty of that is if you have this way of incorporation and this way of investing in the entire circle, the two together are the two essential pillars to hold up a circular economy, a regenerative economy, whatever it is. And in particular, as you may recall, Brian, from our first conversation, you said to me, "Oh, Graham, I think that takes away the first mover disadvantage that prevents circles from starting in the first place."
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point to remember that conversation. One comment I want to make based off of what you were saying too, and going back to that idea that I think one kind of material flow or one section of the economy will be most likely to kind of become circular before other ones, and then that will kind of spread from there. I think a really exciting opportunity is if that material flow or that material type can be something that has the capacity to be regenerative. That would be really profound, and there's a huge extra benefit you can create if that material type has strong power to be regenerative in nature, because some material flows have minimal power to be regenerative and other ones have massive power to be regenerative. Specifically, agriculture, I think, is a prime example of that.
Yes, cool. Thank you. So I'll bring it now back to the audience. Aletta, would you like to serve us with your contribution?
Yes, thank you. I want to come back to the elephant around the final destination of waste, of landfills. I think that it calls for paying more attention to how nature actually does this more than 100% recycling, you know, and just from a very sort of superficial perspective, if you consider the amount of organisms that are involved in this, you know, waste recycling in nature, it's like huge. It's like the base of the pyramid. And I'm wondering to what extent that whether such energy is really dedicated to finding better ways of dealing with our waste, because, you know, to expect people, as we've heard here in this conversation, that people are often not aware or willing to take the steps, you know, to really do things more consciously, and that requires a lot of education. So I'm not saying that that must not happen, but that is a slow process. And I'm wondering, with things like the development in modern technology and artificial intelligence and all these things, how is it possible that we're not actually doing better at the level of the landfill? That's my question.
Beautiful. Right before I pass it on to the panelists, I just want to request to keep it to the essence of your contribution when you're answering the questions so that we can get through everybody. And for sure, we will bring up these topics again in the after party, if you will. So yeah, thank you.
Graham, do you want to go first?
I'm more than happy if you go first.
Okay, sure. I think one key requirement to address that really valuable point that you're bringing up is, once again, it probably comes down to having the right incentives or the right regulation in place. Putting cost on things. There's a lot of places where, as an example, I used to live on an island in Canada. It was a small island. There was no waste management facility on the island. If you want to get rid of a standard bag of garbage, the cost, I think it was $7. So if you take a little micro environment like that, an island, where if you create one bag of garbage, you have to pay $7, that creates a lot of motivation to reduce the amount of garbage you get. And people on that island became very effective at making sure they're composting, making sure they're recycling everything as much as possible. So that's not a perfect answer, but it's an answer I think that is high level, what is required to move towards a better system where there's less waste going into that waste management system. And realize too that a waste management system is a human construct. Nature doesn't really create waste. Nature doesn't view a leaf as waste. It views it as something that will help the soil and create value for the whole ecosystem around it. We see leaves, like think of many different urban environments. Leaves fall to the ground. The person's like, oh, what a pain, this stupid tree. I hear people say, well, let's cut this tree. They call the city and say, cut this tree down. It's dumping leaves all over the place, making a big mess. They have zero understanding of the ecosystem services that tree is creating for them. And they will literally like whine and complain and get that tree cut down because it's making a mess with the leaves. But the ecosystem, the forest, can create massive amounts of value and utility from those leaves for the whole ecosystem. So we need to put in play a system that is better able to think more like nature and less thinking and just a really take, make, consume, throw away mindset. Graham, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. I'll put in two thoughts. The first thought is technology is absolutely not the problem. We've had all of the technology we've needed for decades to do this. That's absolutely not the problem. I think the real problem is that combination of psychologic. We talk about it as waste, when actually we should talk about it as raw materials for the next stage. And that's how nature works. Everything is raw material for something else, even if it's waste for the first thing. So it's, the psychologic, how do we talk about it? What is the mindset we're using? And then secondly, the entire system. Again, back to neoclassical economics and its neglect of ergodicity and its myth that a company is a thing to be owned rather than a person. And that combination sets us up for what we have today. It's a strategy designed to deliver what we have. And at the heart of that is, it makes it very, very easy to say, oh, this is somebody else's problem. And we make all of the benefits go this way, and all of the costs become negative externalities that become somebody else's problem, which is why I keep banging on about the necessity of incorporating as a fair shares commons. So nothing is somebody else's problem. Everything is our problem. Check.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, bringing it back to the audience. Sharon, please.
Yes, sorry, I'm going to be off camera. I've had some dental work done, so I can't really, I don't want to share my face at the moment. But what I want to say is I love this conversation, and I live in a state in the US that is relatively small. It has a lot of agriculture, but also small businesses. And the issue that I've seen, and that's very creative, and there are great ideas in my area, etc. And the minute, though, that idea or group of people need money to actually move it forward and move and see and get an investor, there is no way that the investors understand or would invest in something that is not a quote unquote proven. And so I'm just pointing to this, that I'm seeing not only in my state, but beyond, people and small businesses trying to start, and they're part of somebody else's supply chain or possibility. But how, you know, the idea of coming together in a fair shares commons, which is great, but financially, when it comes down to getting the money to do what you want to do and you see it as possible, you're almost forced, or at least I've observed this, to put it into the paradigm that will attract an investor in the current thinking. And so it really is requiring a new way to attract financially the money to be able to not only start your idea or invest it even in a group, but also that the financing allows it to change and evolve as you move forward, because nothing stays the same. So I'm just throwing that into the pot about, you know, circularity. It's never, it's wonderful, and it changes. And investors have a hard time. They want the predictability of how it's going to perform per se. So that's just one thing to think about. And there's a lot of small businesses, in my experience, that are doing amazing or wanting to do amazing things. And we may be at a place where, how do we bring them together?
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, just before the panelists jump in, I just want to process check as well. We'll probably go a little bit over the time, but I just want to ask the audience to please stay with us for a couple more minutes so we can also hear the contribution from Randy. And then we'll officialize the closing of the segment and move on to, if you will, the after party. So, but yeah, just hang out with us here for a couple extra minutes. Thank you.
And just also to that, we will continue to field questions for half an hour after the scheduled end, and we'll try to stick as tightly as possible to the scheduled end for people who have other commitments. So I'll just put in one brief comment. Sharon, what you've said is absolutely spot on. It's been the primary barrier that I've seen from the beginning. And we have to find a way of cracking that nut. Check.
Okay, I've got one comment I can bring out to the table to kind of address some of the core challenges that Sharon was bringing up. I think it's really, it is like when the rubber meets the road, it's like who's gonna sign the check, who's going to put the investment in. We need to think a little bit different. We need to find softer forms of capital that are more adaptive. You can't think from a very conventional bank format, from a very conventional venture capital format. And on that note, I just put an article in the chat. This is an article I was just reading about a early 2024 $100 million project that the World Bank is financing. They're protecting the capital. So it's basically a bond that protects the capital that goes into the project. And it's to fund and enable $100 million in recycling infrastructure development in Indonesia and Ghana. I think if you came to the average investor and said, hey, do you want to fund a $100 million recycling infrastructure project in Ghana and Indonesia, there might not be a lot of people keen to invest in that. But if you have someone bringing in, protecting that investment, that can make it a lot more viable to happen. And I think this example of the article I put in on this $100 million project by the World Bank is a good example of some interesting financial architecture that can enable those types of challenges to be solved.
Amazing. Yeah, let's please actually stick on that and the after party because that's definitely a critically important topic. Okay, and bringing it back to Randy, please go ahead.
Actually,
so much.
Stefan, Randy, are you okay asking your question in the after party?
I'm gonna have to hop, but that's quite all right. It's no big deal if I don't have a chance to
Right.
share.
I
You
think-
manage the session however makes sense.
I think, Stefan, let's wrap this bit up, our bit at this point,
Okay.
and then go into the after party.
Okay, cool. So let's move ahead with that. So this is the official closing of the session. We'll just do a little bit one thing before. So thank you for showing up. Thank you to the panelists. I also want to provide this as an opportunity for the panelists to plug in any good stuff that they know about that we could all benefit from, whether that's something from their own projects or if they want to give any shout outs to any cool initiatives out there. And with that, we will leave you with officially the conclusion of this session. So please take it away, Graham and Brian, any cool plugs you got.
Yeah, so the brief thing from our side, I've talked about ergodicity as a key strategy in the Fair Shares Commons. We'll be running in a couple of weeks' time our next Ergodicity 101 for anybody who wants to come along and learn more about how that works. And a reminder of my book on exactly how to do that. That's out and available to purchase from Amazon or your preferred local book retailer. And over to you, Brian.
I'm not sure if I have anything off the top of my head that I can mention, other than maybe that that one article that I just put in. I think that's a really critical thing to think about as well, because finance is what unlocks. It's a really critical unlock for the circular economy. So thinking of creative ways that finance can be used to enable the circular economy is a really critical challenge. So that's something to think about as well.
Brilliant,
Perfect.
absolutely. So one last thing from my side, just to emphasize here that indeed, yes, Evolutesix is running the Ergodicity 101 course, and we want to give a little gift to everybody that is in the session here today. The cohort is starting on April 9th, and we'll be sharing a discount code. So if you guys would like to sign up to the course within the next 48 hours, you will be granted with a 25% discount, and I will be sharing that code in just one moment, as well as in a follow-up email if you need any extra time to consider. So with that being said, we are officially closing the session, and we'll be moving into the after party, which we would like to handle that more as a dialogue between all the participants. So to stick with time, I would like then, unless with any